You are listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 7th of June 2022 on Monocle 24.
The latest from Ukraine from one member of the country's parliament. What, if anything, can be done about Russia's blockade of Ukraine's food exports? And what impression of the UK has the last very strange week given the world? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Nabila Ramdani and Gwilym David Blunt will discuss all today's big stories. Plus we'll have a report on Los Angeles' mayoral election and we'll hear from our team at Salone del Mobile in Milan. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller and I'm joined today by the journalist and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani and by Gwilym David Blunt, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at City University of London. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
It's good to see you again, Nabila, and it's good to see you for the first time, David. And as, well, I say it's a tradition. We did it yesterday, so let's stick with it. When we have a guest on the Daily for the first time, you can have a bit of time now to explain yourself to our listeners.
Oh,
Who
wow.
are you and how did you get here?
Right. Well, as you said, I'm a senior lecturer at City University of London in the International Politics Department, and I write about international politics, shockingly, especially about issues on global poverty and inequality, but also interstate violence and war. So, it's all the cheerful topics. And, well, that's me in a nutshell, I guess.
And for the benefit of listeners currently arguing amongst themselves about where your accent is from?
I am a proud Canadian, but I've lived in the UK for about 14 years, so it's a little bit softer. I might not be as oot and a boot as I was when I arrived here, but, it's still there if you dig deep.
Does it return when you either go back to Canada, interact with other Canadians, or perhaps have a few drinks? Because in various combinations of those things, I am aware that I go full Steve Irwin after a bit.
Oh, gosh, yeah. If you get a bunch of Canadians around me, we're going to be talking about hockey. I'm going to be like, oh, my gosh, did you see that power play? What an amazing goal. Amazing, I tell you. But I try to soften it when I'm being professional, obviously.
Obviously. And Nabila, sticking with the subject of sporting events, you were, in fact, at the woebegone Champions League final in Paris. We were talking about this earlier, and you saw in Paris, of all places, examples of disorganisation and heavy-handed policing.
Well, absolutely. Well, Paris is my home city. That's where I grew up. So I regularly take trips there to cover stories as part of my journalism. And unsurprisingly, when you travel to Paris and there's an event going on, you can be absolutely sure that you'll be met with a tube strike, baton charges and tear gas by the police. And that's exactly what happened on the day of the final of the Champions League, as we could all witness. Usually it remains a domestic event when protesters are met with such a response by the French authorities. But because it was such an international event that was projected on the world map, we could all get to see how, the French authorities work, essentially.
Well, hopefully we will be returning later in the show to the theme of how the domestic travails of particular countries are perceived abroad. But we will start with Ukraine, where fighting is continuing for key cities in the country's east. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has described the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which had a combined pre-war population of roughly 200,000 people, as dead. And if both fall to Russia, Russia's conquest of the Luhansk Oblast will look more or less complete. We're joined first of all by Lesia Vasilenko, a member of Ukraine's parliament. Lesia, welcome back to the Monocle Daily. What is the latest you are hearing from where the fighting is heaviest in Luhansk?
Good evening, and you are absolutely right in saying that the Luhansk region and the Donetsk region have the heaviest fighting going on at this point in time, but it is also the southern parts of Ukraine, when Kherson and just sort of like the whole along the Russian-Ukrainian border, the southeast and east, is where the drama is enrolling right now. We know that part of the city of Severodonetsk, which is the last standing city in the Luhansk region, is under Ukrainian control, and Ukraine has regained control over that city. Part of it remains under Russian control. But the Ukrainian forces are resolved to keep pushing and keep fighting for the right of Ukrainians there to remain Ukrainian.
President Zelensky, of course, visited the front lines of the Donbass at the weekend. Is Ukraine's official view still that that territory can be defended and perhaps even claimed back from Russia?
That territory must be defended and must be claimed back as all other territories that are currently under occupation by Russia. And it is not just in Ukraine's interest to do so, but it's in the interest of global peace and stability. If we leave any territories to Russia to hold under their control, we're essentially, as a global community, saying okay to aggression and saying okay to one country just blatantly occupying the territory of another country. And I don't think this is the world that we want to be living in, and I don't think this is the heritage that we want to leave for future generations.
President Zelensky also spoke in very stark terms over the weekend of the casualties beginning to be incurred by the Ukrainian armed forces. He was talking about dead and wounded running into hundreds of troops every day. Ukraine has, of course, started to take delivery of these long-range missile systems from the United States and the United Kingdom. What else does Ukraine still need?
We need the weapons. We have submitted list after list of the needs for weapons and ammunition to different world leaders, to different ministries of defenses of pretty much every single democratic country around the planet. The weapon deliveries are coming, but I would like to see them come much faster and in much larger numbers, because what we are faced with is an all-in war Russia is waging across all of the territory of Ukraine, and they are sparing no resources and no ammunition to fight it. Neither should Ukraine and Ukraine's army be constrained by the fact that we simply do not have enough ammunition to go around.
Well, what impression do you have, or I guess what impression are Ukraine's defensive authorities starting to form about what the next phase of the war will be like?
Unfortunately, Russia is good at protracted conflicts, and this is what they are trying to get Ukraine into yet again. Basically, their tactic in this war of attrition is to tire out the enemy. In this case, Russia is trying to tire out Ukraine, but with Ukraine, Russia is also trying to tire out the whole of the international community and the support that Ukraine is getting from the international community. The longer this war lasts, the more expensive it becomes, both internally in Ukraine and externally for the international allies who are supporting us worldwide.
We will be returning later in the show to the theme of the UK's Prime Minister and his current difficulties. But just finally, Lesia, has the survival, at least for the moment, of Boris Johnson been a big story in Ukraine? He has, of course, been one of Ukraine's most forthright advocates on the world stage.
And Ukraine has been very grateful to that. Actually, yesterday, the vote happened quite late on under Ukrainian time, basically closer to midnight by Ukrainian time. And yet, as I opened my Facebook feed, literally every single post on there was about expressing support and happiness at the fact that Boris Johnson managed to stay and remain Prime Minister of Great Britain. I think that it's the support that he's been giving to Ukraine in action, but also the fact that he has been very vocal and that he has been one of the first leaders to be here in Ukraine on the ground, not scared one little bit of the Russian missiles and possible Russian attacks. All of these factors helped Ukrainians grow very fond of Boris Johnson, and this is what we have been experiencing yesterday. Although at the same time, Ukraine has no doubt that actually it's all of the UK, all of the UK's citizens, civil society, all of the UK's parties who are standing in for Ukraine, helping us, and not just by political support, but by the material support.
Lesya Vasylenko, thank you as always for joining us. That was Lesya Vasylenko, member of Ukraine's parliament. Well, let's move along slightly and we'll bring our panel back in. Russia's assault upon Ukraine was always going to be a global problem, but it is becoming clear that it might become about as fundamental a global problem as could be imagined. Before the war, Ukraine was a major exporter of grain and wheat, among other staples. Since the war, millions of tons of such produce has been stuck in the port of Odessa. That pinch will shortly be felt, and Russia, as is traditional, denies everything. Yesterday, Moscow's man at the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, flounced from a Security Council meeting upon being accused by European Council President Charles Michel of creating a looming food crisis. Nabila, first of all, is that a fair criticism to suggest that Russia is creating, perhaps even deliberately, a global shortage of staple food supplies?
Well, absolutely. I mean, anybody who knows anything about the nature of warfare knows that it has a massive effect on all aspects of global living. And clearly Russia is exploiting that. And now it's affecting food supplies. Ukraine has always been the wheat basket of Europe. And because it is involved in this horrific war against Russia, this status is disappearing. And Russia is clearly determined to win the war at all costs. And the way it is prosecuting this war is by obliterating as much as possible, and that includes obliterating food supplies from Ukraine. And, there's nothing new in these tactics, We see the starvation tactics used in warfare against civilians in countries from Afghanistan to Yemen. And the common factor is always war. But clearly, in this case, the primary victims are the Ukrainians themselves, of course, but also developing countries who have also become reliant on Ukrainian wheat, and they will now be starved. We're already seeing the ripple effects of such tactics in countries across the Middle East and North Africa, for example, where bread is a staple food. If you look at countries such as Tunisia, Lebanon, Yemen, or indeed Egypt, prices of wheat are already soaring because they import more than a third to more than a half of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. And these are countries that are already facing difficulties such as inflation, food insecurity, and indeed conflict. So you have aid agencies who are extremely concerned about that. And this is why Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, is quite rightly accusing the Russians of using food supplies as a stealth missile against developing countries.
David, this may be a daft question given the strange nihilistic mood that seems to have beset Moscow these last few months, but shouldn't it bother Russia more that quite a lot of the countries likeliest to be worst affected, the ones that Nabila mentions there, are exactly the countries which, though not exactly taking Russia's side these last few months, have been, kind of equivocal about it?
Well, control over the food supply is a very smart move by Putin if we just think about it geostrategically rather than thinking about it morally. Morally, it's abominable to hold back sort of very important staple goods. But if they're controlling the sources of food, it encourages silence and encourages complacence. They don't want people to be, world leaders to be on the stage from North Africa condemning the war. They want them on the sidelines. And in the developing world, it's been viewed as a European crisis, and it's blackmail. It's a way of silencing critics because they're hoping that it will end quickly and service will resume as usual. Now, whether that's going to happen, given the resistance that's occurred in Ukraine, remains to be seen. But this is what I think was animating the Russian decision. But it's got to have blowback right now, right? If the food doesn't get delivered, there's going to be more and more pressure coming from the developing world for some sort of ceasefire, some sort of resolution. These states that are generally perhaps sympathetic or willing to bandwagon around Russia to counterbalance other influences in the region are going to become less inclined to toe the Moscow line. So again, we're seeing Russians pursuing a very blunt policy, and they're going to have blowback from it in the future.
Nabila, is there therefore an imperative for portions of the world to rethink their food supplies as we have seen Europe rethinking its energy supplies in the last few months?
Well, you quite rightly, pointing to the fact that the problem we're having with Russia using food supplies as a form of blackmail, as David says, the same is happening with energy supplies. But I think it's fair to say that perhaps only solution would be to stop the war, I'm afraid, because that's the only way that, we can get out of this situation. The world is increasingly interconnected in so many ways that, supply systems are well-established systems that cannot change just instantly and overnight. And it's the same for energy, but, and I'm afraid to say that pressuring Russia more, and the only way we've been able to pressure Russia so far in the West was to put a sanction on Russia. But I'm afraid that more sanctions on Russia will lead to a negative impact on the West. So it almost shows the chaos of the situation, and again how interconnected we all are. So it seems a bit hopeless, dare I say, but something has to be done about the fact that Russians are deliberately holding millions of tons of grain and wheat in the ports in the Black Sea, and indeed they're stealing from those grains as well, which contributes to a worsening of the global food crisis.
Just one final quick thought on this, David. It's not it's a fairly recherché suggestion so far, at least, but there is something that could be done which might walk the line NATO has drawn itself of not getting directly involved in the conflict. If they were to say, we are coming there to open up the port of Odessa, we will get that grain out of there, and don't get in our way as we do that.
I would see that as being an incredibly risky move by NATO. One of the things that the NATO powers have done, they've been willing to provide arms to Ukraine at a limited capacity. If they were to send a naval flotilla through the Bosphorus towards Odessa, it would set up a situation that would make the Cuban Missile Crisis be a comparable event, right? If there was shooting between an American warship and a Russian warship, this would be catastrophic. I don't think Joe Biden would be lining up for this. I don't think we could force open Odessa without running a serious risk of a hot escalation of the conflict. In terms of how do we get this grain to be released into the world economy, I don't see how we do it unless we continue to pressure Russia. If we make Russia's war effort unsustainable by cutting it off from international finance, by cutting it off from the money supplies that it needs to fund its war machine, then we might see the grain flow again. But I don't know whether we can force it, not unless we're willing to commit to shooting.
Yeah. Well, as we were hearing earlier, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has found the time today to express his relief at the political survival of his fellow professional clown turned national leader, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Johnson yesterday won, if unconvincingly, a confidence vote by his fellow Conservative MPs. This demonstration of governmental instability juxtaposing amusingly with the preceding long weekend celebration of institutional stability, i.e. the Platinum Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II. Nabila, first of all, possibly Pollyanna-ish analysis of that juxtaposition. Is there an argument that what we have actually seen is a brilliant display of how constitutional monarchy is supposed to work? You have the stable pillar holding everything together. I was about to say something about an overarching pillar right there, but that's just an architectural impossibility. But you know what I'm saying. The solid pillar around which the chaos and rough and tumble of politics occurs.
Yes, I think, the Jubilee weekend has proved that, soft power in Britain was sky high. I mean, you couldn't get a better display of soft power, I would contend anyway. And I think the personification of the British state was not only showing off the pomp and circumstance which the British are renowned for, but also a modern, tolerant and hugely creative country. We were reminded effectively that Britain is the pop music capital, London is the pop music capital of the world. And it can also show off its military bands and traditional bands like that. So how on earth can anybody accuse Britain of being a stuffy, reactionary country when you have rap artists and liberal political figures such as Michelle Obama praising the Queen to the hilt? I think
This is almost treacherous talk from a Frenchwoman, Nabila.
Well, it has to be said. I think it's due to the fact that the Queen has long ago forfeited that previous justification for the monarchy, which was to do with divine right. That is, that she's ordained by God. But instead, I think she managed to turn the institution into a public service institution. And that's arguably the best component of British identity.
David, we did hear from Lesia Vasylenko earlier in the show, the Ukrainian MP, talking about the widespread online rejoicing in Ukraine at Boris Johnson's survival. Is it uncommon for national leaders to be rather more liked abroad than they are by the people who actually elected them?
Oh, I think it's actually quite a common phenomenon. We might call it the Gorbachev phenomenon if you remember the 1980s. You know, Gorbachev was feted across the world as a great statesman, but if you went to the streets of what was then Leningrad or Moscow, reviled in 1987, 1988, he was not a popular man. Yet, if you read Time magazine, you'd think he would have been, the bee's knees. Not the case. Now, Johnson might have a little bit of Gorbachev happening. He's been very forthright in his support for Ukraine. It's understandable that the Ukrainians would be happy that he would be sort of continuing in post. But then, you'd think, well, they'd say that anyway, right? He's not going to be like, Zelensky's not going to say, oh, Boris won? Oh, God, that's terrible. He's going to toe the line. And the thing that we might say, well, is Boris really cutting a statesman-like figure on the world stage? Would any other British prime minister be doing exactly what he's doing right now? So I'm not sure whether if we were to go outside of Ukraine, whether people would say, oh, yes, Johnson, the great statesman, how blessed you are to have him in number 10 Downing Street. I feel like he's not so much Gorbachev, he's more Yeltsin. A joke abroad and a tragedy at home.
But dare I say, isn't it also because it's the convention, effectively, that foreign leaders do not interfere in the domestic problems of other states?
Of course.
And foreign leaders are quite rightly saying next to nothing about Boris Johnson or his problems because, they're all going through some kinds of problems. I think Macron is desperately trying to build up a parliamentary majority in the upcoming elections, for example. Joe Biden is dealing with a routine gun violence problem and a Trumpian vote that literally despise him. So, they're all a bit caught up in their own
You're absolutely
problems.
right. There's an unspoken rule in international relations that you don't criticize another leader unless things are really bad. It shows a very bad diplomatic impasse if you start flinging mud at each other on the world stage. And you do see it, between America and China all the time. They'll start sort of accusing each other of imperialism or what have you. But between friendly states or neutral states, you just keep it civil.
Just a final quick thought on this, David. Is Boris Johnson diminished on the world stage by what happened yesterday? That it's now well known that he is domestically a bit damaged and vulnerable, that fully 41% of his own MPs would rather he wasn't the Prime Minister?
Yeah, you can't avoid that, right? Now, this is not the man who walked into Downing Street with a 90-seat majority, who looked like he had changed the entire map of British politics, who had a huge electoral mandate to get Brexit done. If I was someone in Brussels, I would be looking at a bit of blood in the water when it comes to this negotiation over Northern Ireland. But at the same time, this might be something that is dangerous, right? He might be willing to take risks that he wouldn't take if he was secure. So perhaps Brussels is also thinking, oh, God, what is he going to do now? What's the next, ludicrous populist policy he's going to throw to the Sun readers?
We've already had a reversion to imperial measures, so pound, shilling and pence and public hanging still await, I suspect. David Blunt, and Nabila Ramdani, thank you both for the moment. We will have more from you later in the show. But now Los Angeles goes to the polls today to begin perhaps deciding on a new mayor. The term-limited incumbent Eric Garcetti is off to become the United States ambassador to India, and the frontrunners to replace him are Democratic Congresswoman Karen Bass and billionaire property magnate Rick Caruso, a rather more recent arrival in the Democrats' ranks. Our US editor Chris Lord reports from Los Angeles.
Think nobody can clean up LA?
Like so much here in Los Angeles, the race for City Hall is high drama.
I'm running for mayor because the city we love is in a state of emergency. Rampant homelessness, people living in fear for their safety, and politicians at City Hall just in it for themselves. My only special interest...
That's billionaire mall developer Rick Caruso, who says he'll work for $1 a year if elected mayor. Today, Angelinos will go to the polls for the primary's vote. If any candidate gets more than 50% today, they'll be the next mayor of LA. That's unlikely. So the final vote will probably go to November. There are, however, two clear frontrunners in this race, Rick Caruso and Congresswoman Karen Bass.
And now I'm running for mayor to meet today's challenges: crime, homelessness, and the soaring cost of housing. I'm Karen Bass, and I always run toward a crisis to get the job done for you.
In every campaign ad and every celebrity endorsement, even Snoop Dogg has thrown himself behind a candidate, there is a sense of a pressing, immediate need for change in Los Angeles. The pandemic has hit this city hard, and it's caused the crisis that everyone's been talking about for years, homelessness, to balloon out of control. Anna Scott is the homelessness reporter for KCRW, an LA radio station, and she was the moderator for the last mayoral debate before the primaries today. I asked Anna to set out the scale of homelessness in LA.
There are more than 66,000 people who are unhoused in all of Los Angeles County, and more than half of them are inside LA city limits. And so what that looks like as you're going around Los Angeles is you see a lot of people sleeping in parks, you see people on sidewalks, there are tent cities under just about every freeway overpass. And as homelessness has increased in recent years, that visibility has increased as well, even in fancier neighborhoods that maybe in past decades could have ignored the problem. And that's why this has become the dominant issue in the mayor's race. Declaring a state of emergency for the city would give the mayor some special powers that otherwise they wouldn't have. So he could commandeer properties, he could seize hotels theoretically, or something like that, and start putting people in them. He would have some power to rezone certain kinds of land, right, and maybe accommodate more interim housing on those sites or something like that. But he hasn't said exactly what he would do if he did declare a state of emergency. I mean, it's sort of hard to imagine, that it would be realistic for him to start seizing properties and putting people in them.
The other frontrunner here is Congresswoman Karen Bass. She's made an interesting pledge, which is that 15,000 people, she will get them housed in her first year in office. Is that realistic, 15,000 people in 1 year?
It's not really clear, actually, whether she's talking entirely about shelter emergency beds or how many of those beds would be permanent. That makes a huge difference in terms of assessing the viability of this plan. Where would these facilities be? Where would they go? You're probably going to get some neighborhood opposition if you're trying to put them all over. So it's just like all these promises, the devil's in the details. The truth is homelessness is a national crisis, and many of the driving forces behind it, which are primarily economic inequality and poverty, are beyond local control.
Mayoral races can quite often feel in the weeds of local politics, especially if you don't live in the city. But LA is different. It is a vast, influential metropolis in the US, and like several cities in Democrat-run states, its problems with homelessness and rise in violent crime have become, for Republicans and the more partisan media outlets here, a stick to beat the Democrats with, a poster child, if you will, for poor governance. Countering that narrative, I think, matters on the road to the presidential election in 2024. Monocle's US political correspondent, Sasha Issenberg.
Beginning in the 1990s, there was an unquestioned improvement in quality of life in big cities in the United States. Crime was down. It seemed like a lot of things related to homelessness, vagrancy. It became a lot harder, I think, over the last generation or so for Republicans to point to New York or San Francisco or Chicago as illustrative of problems. They were the engines of American business. They were growing almost, across the board. And they became desirable for suburbanites who, through the late 20th century, when crime and drugs were on the rise, never imagined that they'd want to live in cities. And I think that's receded a little bit. There has been certainly not a return to the crime levels of the 1980s or early 90s, but there has been an uptick in various forms of violent crime in the last few years. And so I think that it has become a more natural point of attack or criticism for folks on the right to be able to see things in cities that they can claim are illustrative of poor governance.
That was Monocle's Chris Lord in conversation with Anna Scott of KCRW and with Monocle's Sasha Issenberg. David, first of all, to look at the insurgent challenger, if you will, Rick Caruso, self-promoting billionaire real estate tycoon, wants to run the government. What could go wrong?
Oh, I do not have any time for billionaires playing politician. This is an idea that has captured the American imagination and the imagination of many of the Western democracies, that if someone is successful at business, somehow this makes them good at absolutely everything, as if they are so blessed with knowledge of this different world that none of us live in, but they can fix everything if they, quote, run it like a business. And government is not a business, right? If we want to know why there's so many problems in Los Angeles, it comes down to the fact that over the past 30 years, Republicans and then Democrats have been slowly stripping away the state, privatizing public goods. And then when people say, oh, governance has gotten so bad, this is such a bad governing problem, so of course it is. We have been gutting the state, the things that provides education, that provides healthcare, that provides mental health assistance. And then some people are like, oh, shocked. Someone get a businessman in and run it. It drives me absolutely mad because these people have been carpetbagging the American state since Reagan. And no one seems willing to call them out on it.
Well, not least because, Nabila, in a lot of the countries that you report from in particular, there have been plenty of examples of governments being run by like businesses, at least to the extent that they are run for the profit at the people of the top of the governments, and it hasn't necessarily gone all that well.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, business people can make good politicians, but I think the danger is when corruption and sleaze, which are so often associated with the brutal world of business, is applied to politics, and that's when things go wrong. But I would introduce a caveat to what you've just said, David, I think. Yes, traditionally, you would expect politicians to come from a professional background, such as the law, for example. But look at the most famous living tycoon turned politician is Donald Trump, of course. He believed that his skills and indeed his experience that he built over the years, at the cutting edge of deal making, would suit government. And I have to say, there is an obvious rationale to this argument. I think that politics in the end is about the allocation of resources and indeed the use of budget. So, politicians who, in my view, solely have ideals and who want to virtue signal don't get very far at all. To be an effective Western politician, you need to really understand capitalism and how it affects every walk of life. And it might sound cynical, but it's absolutely true. I mean, look at how Margaret Thatcher applied ruthless monetarism to everything. She was massively criticised for this, but it was a time when Labour Council all went bankrupt, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, but at the same time, this importing of business acumen into politics has led to great human tragedy, right? The capitalist understands capitalism from a very different perspective than a politician should. A politician has to think about how do we distribute the benefits and burdens of social cooperation so that we have a fair society. A capitalist like Donald Trump thinks, how can I enrich myself and my shareholders? And that is a very different attitude than what we want in a democracy. Democracy should at least have the premise that we're all equal. Capitalism doesn't work that way. You're only as equal as the money in your wallet.
Well, on a semi-related subject in that it does involve the allocation of the state's resources, the last couple of years have been a struggle for urban transit systems around the world. Their core business model of moving large numbers of people from where they live to where they work has been hollowed out by COVID-19, and it is increasingly clear that large numbers of people plan to continue working where they live to at least some extent. That being the case, other sources of revenue are being sought, and the metro in Seoul, for one, plans to extend its established practice of selling subsidiary naming rights to the network stations. For about $700,000 you could have your name in brackets on the station signage. Nabila, are we fans of this? Is this a good idea? Would you like to have arrived here via Bond Street in association with, I don't know, Harrods?
Well, the main point here is that the funding of transport system is the same as funding anything else, and it requires a huge amount of money. So you have to find creative ways of funding it, especially when you consider that it's an investment, that it's a long-term investment. But what we're really discussing here, I suppose, is the public-private partnership. I think transport systems are obviously of massive use to the public sector and are, of course, a public asset, but the private sector, of course, can gain great advantage from investing in them. And tube naming or station naming is just like stadium naming. For example, if you name a sporting asset that attracts thousands of people every year, and you name it after an airline like the Emirates, as the Arsenal Stadium is called.
That only works with new stadiums, though, doesn't it? Because I think my experience, at least, is the old ones with an established name, when they sell their naming rights, no one ever calls them that. I mean, the ground where my football team play will always be Cardinia Park to me. I know it's called officially something else, and I don't even know what that is. Are you a fan? Have we missed a trick, David, in not calling the Elizabeth line the TK Maxx line?
Well, look, I feel like I'm sort of fully occupying old man corner here. But does everything have to be for sale in our society? Do we have to say, oh, yeah, just chuck this on the market, see what we can get for it? What we're talking about, the private sector benefits immensely from public transportation. Think about all the workers in the City of London who, in the pre-COVID times used to stream in from Waterloo and Liverpool Street, all to go work at merchant banks, all with which are benefiting from public transport. So, my mind is like, well, how much are they paying for it? What's the benefit that they get? Do they return the investment that they get from our society? And part of me is just like, I don't know. I've seen corporate tax levels right now, and they are not particularly impressive. So maybe we want to make Goldman Sachs pay a little bit more in tax to occupy the City of London.
Do they get naming rights for the station?
Well, I would say no. Perhaps they just don't get a big sanction if they just pay their taxes. It's a shocking thing. I have to pay my taxes. I don't see why these massive multinational corporations can get away with paying about 5 pence in their annual taxation.
We thought it would be fun to conclude the panel's deliberations this evening by asking each of you if you have a particular favourite public transport network of any sort anywhere in the world. I'm obviously going to stake a claim on the Sydney Harbour ferries right now. I bagsied that. I saw it first. But yeah, they are wondrous, and I was just there last month sitting on the front of one of the new catamarans thinking, I can't believe some people get to call this a commute. Nabila?
You know what? I'm going to root for the London Underground system because...
Controversial after yesterday.
Because it's a Victorian mode of transport, if you think about it. It dates back to the Industrial Revolution, and yet it's still brilliantly run and very effective.
Again, this is possibly not the optimal week. You could have been arguing that. He said, speaking as somebody who it took 2 hours to get home last night.
Yes.
But
You've got the occasional strike.
You do have the occasional strike, but it's not like we're living in Paris or anything.
Precisely.
David, do you have a favourite?
All right, look, I'm going to be boring and I'm going to agree. London Underground is the best in the world. I grew up in Toronto, which is a city of 5 million-ish people, and there are 2 subway lines that run across the city. You can go north and south, and you can go east and west. So when I moved to London and I looked at the tube map, I was like, oh my God, I don't need a car to live in the city. I can just take a tube anywhere. And if I can't take the tube, I can take the bus. And I know we love to complain. Like, it's part of being a Londoner. You got to complain about TfL. But sometimes when I go home, I miss the Bakerloo line. And that's something that no one should admit on air to people who are from London, but it is true.
An extraordinary debut performance there, David. David Blunt and Nabila Ramdani, thank you both very much for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the Salone del Mobile Furniture Fair opened today at the Rofiera Milano Fairgrounds in Milan, and Monocle is there all week. One of the companies gaining attention is Vero, a new Italian furniture brand known for its hyper-local manufacturing principles and attempts to shift Italian design forward. Monocle's Marcus Hippi spoke to Vero's creative directors, Simona Flacco and Riccardo Crana.
Okay, we started working on Vero 1.5 years ago, where we met for the first time Pasquale Apollonio, the owner of the brand. We talked a lot about design industry, our idea of this industry, and our shared values. We thought that it's the time to do something together to change this industry. And we started working on Vero, and we built a brand, a community, and a dream team.
The vision of Vero is transforming homes in contemporary place. This is our purpose. In our opinion, we had to do this with 3 key points: the values of the brand, the community of the brand. The community is also the team, the designers, but also the people we follow the brand, and the communication of the brand, because Simona and I are the creative director of the brand, but also Simple Flair manage the communication of Vero, and it's our opinion that the design brand have to improve the communication today.
How? What do you mean by that, improving communication?
We work a lot in a digital way, but we hope that Vero is both digital and physical. In fact, we are opening our space in Milano, and we are following a strategy since day zero.
In my opinion, the design brand have to tell a story. Tell a story about the designers, about the products, about the manufacturing. Yeah, the production, because the social media or some digital tools or physical tools can build a community of people, and every brand can be alive only with the community.
How does all that relate to the rather grand Italian design history? What's your relationship with that?
It's not easy, because Made in Italy has a long story, and we are respecting what other people did in the past years in the history, but we think we need a contemporary twist, something new with another point of view, with the need to share a vision, values, not only products, not only technical details or materials.
Vero has its roots in the Italian way of design history, but we want to give a voice of every single designers. Every piece of Vero, it's an expression of the single designer. One pieces, one designers, and every designer can show your aim in Vero.
Just to give us some examples, what are some of the favorite things you have been working on recently? Some favorite things on Vero, yeah, that it would nicely exemplify what you've been doing.
Tomorrow we present new pieces designed by Sam Stewart and Zaven, and I think we will share our vision, very international, because Sam is from New York City and Zaven is from Venice, Italy, United States. Other designers are from Sweden, from South Africa, from all around Italy, from all around the world. And we are loving this part of the job because, first of all, we are working with amazing creatives, and not only on developing a collection.
Personally, I love the new vessel of Sam Stewart, because like every pieces can transform the homes in contemporary place, because every pieces have a name, have a strong identity in the space.
I think something we should talk about is obviously also a thing that is a great value you have, which is to rely on a skilled network of artisans and local suppliers. Locality is very important for you. Tell us more about that.
We think that local is a bridge to connect Italy to all other cool places around the world. Our production is based in Italy, but it's only a starting point. Is very important for the quality of every single piece we introduce in the collection, but it's not everything, is a starting point.
We think that the local approach is the only way to be international, because you can develop the local community. And in the local community there are the true values, the Vero values.
Finally, tell us what you're going to be up to here in Milan this week at Salone. You've been mentioning something already.
We are really enjoying this time in Milano, and we are meeting really interesting people during these days. Tonight we present an exhibition at our space, Riviera, with Marco Campardo, an Italian designer based in London. And tomorrow we present the second drop from Vero, and we hope to see every amazing exhibition, piece, furniture around the city during the week.
The perfect occasion to meet people, to meet friends and our community.
Simona Flacco and Riccardo Crenna, creative directors of the Italian furniture brand Vero, in discussion with Monocle's Marcus Hippi. That is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Nabila Ramdani and David Blunt, also to Lesia Vazilenko in Ukraine. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Lillian Fawcett and Isabel Rosen. Our sound engineer was Callum McLean. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.